Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us today at JALT International 2020. Please welcome Dr. Tamara Swenson and Dr. Brad Visgatis, who will be presenting motivational change after curricular revision. Doctors, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hi, I'm Tamara Swenson, and I teach at Osaka Jogakuin University, which is the site of the study of which we're reporting on today. Next slide, please, Brad.
Oh, okay. Right.
Okay, so our study is about time use out of class by students in a program following a curricular revision. And it's built on work done by Brad for his research on this out of class time use by students throughout Japan. And one of his study populations was at Osaka Jogakuin. Next slide, please. And this is important because there's a lot of government directives on how much time students should be spending out of class for every hour of in-class time. And if you can see on the screen the information that MEX provides us regarding how much time that would actually be. What they expect is a 2-to-1 ratio of in-class time to out-of-class time. So if they're in class an hour, they're expected to do 2 hours of homework related to that class at the university level. It's different formulas for high school, junior high school, and elementary school, but for our purposes, we're talking about a 2-to-1 ratio at the university level. So this determines how credits are calculated and awarded for various classes in all university settings throughout Japan. And the same basic formula applies worldwide. And so if you go to international sites, the United States, or you go to specific universities, you'll find that a similar formula is provided. Next slide, please. So previous research on time use for foreign language study is rather limited, and basically there's one study, Visgatis 2014, and as part of that study, he looked at 26 students that were in a program that he followed for a year. So those 26 students were at Osaka Jogakuin, and we calculated how many students met the 2-to-1 ratio for out-of-class time allocation to homework. None. Not a single one in an intensive program. How many met the 2-to-1 ratio if they were taking enjoyment, listening to music, talking to friends, Skyping with people in other countries? If that was taken into account, one student reached that level for 4 weeks during the study period. Now, part of this is a situation where our students are in an intensive English program where they do have a lot of in-class hours in English. So if you only have 90 minutes a week in an English class, it's pretty easy to do 2 hours of listening to music and meet that 2-to-1 ratio if that's counted as part of your English language study. But if you start looking at actual study time, you start finding nobody's there. Not at a single university that Brad looked at were the students meeting the 2-to-1 ratio if we only looked at study time. Next slide, please. So at Osaka Jogakuin in 2011, when the first data was collected, those were the results that we had. In 2015, we had a major curricular revision, and many changes were made to our curriculum at Osaka Jogakuin. Things like the first year writing class was cut to only meeting once a week, but then a second and third year writing classes were added to make up that time and add on to it, because it was seen as important that students continue writing throughout their first, second, and third year, because their fourth year graduation thesis has to be in English. And so writing was seen to be a skill that we needed to emphasize at each stage of the development. We also added a discussion component in the second year where one had not previously existed. Other aspects of the change were an addition of a research presentation class, which is a sort of a discussion class at the third year. So there was an increase, a net increase in the amount of English class time that these students spent. And so we had full implementation of the new curriculum in 2018, and we reran the study. Next slide, please, Brad. So you can see here some of the major differences. One of the differences that we have to mention here is that in 2011, for the old curriculum, we were using iPods. Every student had an iPod for listening and for phonetics work. In 2018, all students had iPads. In 2012, we went to iPads for all, and we're the first university worldwide to distribute iPads to all their students, beating Duke because we started in April and they started in August. Other changes were the implementation of an extensive reading component, where extensive reading became a required part of the grade. And thanks to Paul, who I see on the stream there, we got access to X reading, and it's been, I think, a good relationship for both of us. The other change was an institution of a cumulative vocabulary program, first run with Memorize, now run through English Central, but it's a required 10% of the students' grade in the classes. In most of their first year classes, as well as second and third year classes, they have this as a required component. You can see the changes in writing courses and discussion courses that also were put into place. Next slide, please. So the rationale for the added components comes from research from several people, primarily for the extensive reading and the vocabulary components, work by David Begler, Stuart McLean, Ryan Hagenrush. Lots of people were involved in our decisions to make these various components required. Stuart McLean's work was clearly foundational, as he was here at the time. He's now elsewhere, but his work really helped inform how we made some changes to our curriculum, as well as we wanted students to try to spend more time on out-of-class study. And so we had to find a way to actually make out-of-class study a class component. If students don't need to study outside of class time, we figured they're gonna not do it. So how do we make it a stronger part of their study program? Next slide, please. So these were our research questions and our hypotheses for this particular study that we're reporting on. We wanted to know how much time students allocated to out-of-class English study in both periods. What were the differences in the amount of out-of-class time used by students between these 2 years, these two groups? Were there significant differences in the degree of motivation between the students? Because motivation seems to be a high predictor of out-of-class time allocation. And what differences were observed in out-of-class time use between the two study periods. And our hypothesis was that students in the 2018 cross-sectional study would spend more time in out-of-class study than those in the 2011 cross-sectional study. Next slide. And the data comes from the two study periods, 2011 and 2018. Cross-sectional studies. We decided that these were more representative of the average student rather than the longitudinal studies, which gave us far more detail about students' out-of-class time use. But given that we were only doing 1 week of data collection in 2018, the 1 week period in 2011 seemed appropriate. And I'm going to turn it over to Brad now.
Okay, so the motivational instrument was based on Dornier, and there were basically intention to learn, ideal L2 self, auto self, influence of significant others, attitudes toward learning English, attitudes toward English language and culture, instrumentality, both promotion and prevention. And the time use was collected through, in both times through a paper survey, where students would write in the month, date, hour, minute of the start and stop times, what activity they engaged in, and a number of other attributes of that activity. And we coded the particular activities, and these are the major areas: 4 skills, interaction, international, license, media and technology, student and support skills. And we had some detailed codes for analyzing these, and they had to be updated for the most recent one because there have been some changes in the types of media and technology that are available. So the first, when we looked at a motivational level to compare the two, we conducted an ANOVA, and we found the results were non-significant. Basically, there was no meaningful change in the level of motivation between students in the original cross-sectional study and the current study. And looked at, I conducted a one-tailed Pearson correlation between motivation level and out-of-class time use, because the assumption would be that more motivated students would spend more time outside of class. The results were statistically significant, but very weak. And in fact, when you look at it, when you think about it, it actually means maybe something like a few minutes per day more. And that's the difference between a high level motivation and low level motivation. And that would be logical because, for example, high level motivation student would be more likely to enroll in an English department or intensive English program where they would be getting a lot of in-class time rather than somebody who is just taking regular courses and then devoting many more hours outside of class. When we compare the minutes per day, looking at both total minutes and the minutes per day, there are 2 different ways of calculating this, because on days when students had no episodes of out-of-class English time, they did not have a way to actually write it down to say that they had nothing in there. So that was a kind of a problem. So you can either take the total minutes and divide it by the number of weeks of data and then divide that by 7 and then multiply that to create a week. Or you can just take the number of minutes and divide by the number of days with data. So these are kind of bookends in the actual amount. It's impossible to measure it more accurately than this, I think. But the main point here, though, is that there's really no significant difference between both of the studies, regardless of whether which method you use for calculating the average days, average minutes per week. And when we compared the distribution according to the day of the week, and the patterns are still very similar. Basically, what happens is that students do the studying the day before a class. Entertainment and stuff, that's more on weekends. But basically, when you get a high like Sunday or Thursday, it apparently would mean that the student had something due on Friday or something due on Monday. When we looked at allocation by purpose, the same kinds of patterns here are relatively remarkably stable, even though there have been curricular changes here. About 2/3 of all of the time and of all of the episodes were devoted to school-related things. That means homework and preparing for classes and such. When we break down the 4 skill area, here you see a change. And this change was a reduction in writing and listening and a better balance winding up for the cross-sectional 2. So this would be a result of the way the curriculum was changed. And so basically what you're getting here is you're getting a redistribution of the time and not necessarily an increase in the amount of time. And then if we look at interaction type here, again, it's very similar pattern. A lot of it is the conversing. This would be whatever, Skype or whatever, you know, just chatting with other students or anything like that. And the teaching, as a lot of the students were involved in teaching at Juku and things like that. So that's where that comes in here. But again, it's remarkably stable over the between the 2 time periods. And we looked at this, and there was a significant difference in the particular support skill that the students had. So for example, the grammar and pronunciation, more of the time was used for that during the cross-sectional one. And since the curricular changes, which increased the vocabulary program and reading, and that changed, and you get much more vocabulary use in the most recent data. If you take a look at, just in general, the proportion of time and the proportion of episodes allocated to school assignments, school-related things, again, it's remarkably stable between the two periods. This is indicating that even if you make curricular changes, you're really not increasing the total amount of time that students spend outside of class. So there seems to be a ceiling effect on that. And I went through and recalculated the cross-sectional data to look at the number of students who had met the two different thresholds, the 1-to-1 threshold or the 2-to-1 threshold. And the upper graph is the most recent study, and there 15 of 100 participants met the 1-to-1 threshold. Now, it's a different number of participants because you have to have a clear data set that has both the number of hours that they're supposed to have in English class so that you can calculate whether the number of hours they have outside of the English class exceeds the 1-to-1 threshold or not. And as you can see, most of the students are below the threshold. And in the original study, cross-sectional one on the bottom there, 217 of 563 participants met the 1-to-1 threshold. So this was surprising to me because the longitudinal study showed that students rarely met that threshold, whereas during this cross-sectional study, they did. And upon reflection, the vast majority of the cross-sectional students had only 1 or 2 English classes per week. And as Tamara mentioned before, if students engaged in such things as listening to music or watching movies in English or something like that, that would count towards those minutes. Okay, Tamara.
Thank you. So from this study, we're making a couple of conclusions that what happens in curricular change has a great deal of effect of what occurs during class time over the 4 years of a program. But it's not going to have a really big shift in students' motivational levels, particularly in students who've already opted in to an English language program. They already have high motivation to learn English, or they wouldn't be here at Osaka Jogaku in particular. The impact on out of class time is far less direct and far less predictable. And it appears that what we're dealing with is a stable amount of time. Students have only so many hours in a day, and they're only going to devote the amount of time that they have available. And that time is not going to show great shifts. I mean, unless somebody finds a way to add another hour to a day, we're still stuck with a 24-hour clock. So what this does warrant is that we need to consider how our curricular changes refocus our students' energies. And what we did see is a refocus on the importance of reading, which led, and as well as some work on discussion skills that were not being done out of class before, which is something that we did want from the curricular change. So that does seem to be successful. We also wanted better balance between the support skills and felt that vocabulary was a foundational skill that we needed to emphasize. And the emphasis on that, as you saw in that slide, seems to have led to a much greater attention to vocabulary. For governments though, and for Ministry of Education in Japan, we need to reconsider, it needs to reconsider the evaluation guidelines in light of the actual amount of time that students are willing to spend outside of class in directed study.
Okay, just so you know, you have 5 minutes left in your presentation.
And we're ready for questions. Next slide, I think, is the blank one.
Yes,
so
Q&A time.
So
before we start Q&A, can we get a big round of applause? Can people please unmute their mics? And thank you for the wonderful presentation.
thank you. And Brad, if you stop share.
Okay.
Okay, are there any questions for either of us? Tetsuya.
Yes, I have a question. Thank you very much for your presentation. Very interesting, very interesting. And I have a question about ANOVA.
Mm-hmm.
You compared the two groups from 2011 and 2018, right?
Yes.
Right.
And these groups are different populations, different groups of students.
Yes.
And in that case, I think it's sometimes we got to think about other factors because populations are different.
Mhm.
For example, did you notice or did you observe some differences among these two groups, like socioeconomic status or Henshachi ranking and other motivation levels, general motivation levels to study?
No. Yeah, the students all drew from the same population at the same university. Similar SES, similar levels of motivation, as you saw from the motivational profiles. Similar classes, similar backgrounds, similar TOEIC levels upon entry. So all of the parameters for the students, they don't change that much at an institution, especially in the Japanese context, where people choose their institution based on their high school counselor's recommendation for the most part. So no, the parameters of the students these were basically matched groups separated by 7 years.
Thank you.
Right. And just to add to that, the motivational instrument we were tied to was the one that I originally used in 2014, and it wasn't a particularly good motivational instrument. And so I didn't expect that I would be able to find any significant difference anyway. So that was a problem. If I were to do it again, I would use a different motivational instrument entirely, one that would be more capable of actually measuring motivation.
But I also think that we have to deal with the fact that motivation for students who've self-selected into an English language program is going to be uniformly the same. It's not like you're dealing with high school kids where some of them were going to be motivated to learn and some of them are not motivated to learn. All of these students opted into an English program.
Yep.
So they should have high motivation or similar motivational profiles throughout their 4 years of university.
Thank you. If you're thinking of using another set of question items, do you have any other questionnaire in mind?
I don't think that any of the current motivational surveys are fine-toothed enough to draw out any differences in motivational levels for students at the university level in self-selected English-focused programs. In a general educational course where you have students across disciplines, from the hard sciences through the social sciences and into sports and arts, I think you would have the instruments would be fine enough to get some differences between those groups. But within a English program, especially an intensive English program like ours, where they have, first year students have 10.5 hours of English class a week. Second year students are still running in 6 or more. They do a lot of things in English and they chose to come. So I don't think any of them are.
Their state motivation may change quite a bit depending upon their performance during each week or each class or something like that, but their overall language learning motivation is going to be relatively stable.
Thank you.
We have a couple questions from Julia. Julia, would you like to just ask your questions or would you like me to read them?
Read them for me, thanks.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry. We have a question for Dr. Swenson. What did you say was the big predictor of outside case study time? And then for Dr. Visgatis, were you able to compare proficiency to outside class study time? Would that have a stronger relationship to outside class study time?
Okay, the biggest predictor of out of class time use were two things: part-time jobs We excluded part-time jobs reporting from the amount of out-of-class time because so many students had part-time jobs where waited on foreign customers, and then they would count that as 5 hours of English contact time, or helping at a juku for 2 hours, or teaching part-time someplace. So we just excluded part-time jobs entirely because it was impossible to control for the differences. The biggest driver seems to be graded homework. If you have to do it, you're gonna do it. And it didn't seem to matter whether the homework was 10% of the grade or 20% of the grade. It's like, okay, they're going to do it. It's homework. And so having the ER program, X reading, and having a cumulative vocabulary program was the big part.
So that's what drove the change in the curriculum.
That's what drove the change in the curriculum was we wanted to have a better balance in the students over their writing primarily, but also their vocabulary and reading. And so changes were made to try to address what we saw as weaknesses in their skills, particularly their writing. And
Okay,
time was not a factor.
To answer the other question very quickly, no, it was not possible to really track proficiency and match that to out-of-class time. However, I would like to add one thing to what Tamara said.
I'm sorry to interrupt real fast. I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you so much.
Okay.
There is another group that will be coming in shortly.
Okay.
So you can carry this on to the Hangouts room. Thank you so much.
Yep. Okay.
Thank you very much. So we would go to Hangout room 13, and I'm going to have to abandon because I have to go back to another meeting. But Brad will be heading to Hangout room 13 with you guys to answer any additional questions, if that seems reasonable.
Yep. Okay.
Okay, so thank you very much, people, and have a very good day. Thank you.
And Brad, thank you very much.
Yep.
Yeah, so I see a lot of familiar names out there, so it's nice to see you all. And let's do this in person sometime in the future.
Good idea.
Okay, bye-bye.
Okay,
Okay.
bye.
Bye.